There's a peculiar phenomenon in Hollywood that rarely gets discussed openly. It's the gap between who we think someone is and who they actually are when the cameras stop rolling. For decades, we've built an image of Jim Carrey as the comedic genius, the man who transformed entertainment through sheer physical brilliance and unpredictable energy. But what happens when someone we respect, someone like Dave Chappelle, encounters that person behind closed doors and finds something entirely different? This is that story. Jim Carrey wasn't born into privilege. He wasn't raised in the Hollywood system, groomed from childhood for stardom. Instead, his origin story reads more like a blueprint for American resilience, one marked by struggle, reinvention, and an almost obsessive need to become something greater than where he started. In the early 1960s, James Eugene Carrey entered the world in a working-class Canadian town where stability was never guaranteed. His father worked in finance and music, perpetually trying to balance family needs with personal ambition. His mother managed the household with the kind of quiet determination that keeps families together during hard times. From his earliest years, Jim was different. While other children played, he experimented with his reflection, contorting his face into expressions that shouldn't have been possible. This wasn't mere silliness. It was exploration, a young mind discovering that his body could communicate something words couldn't. By the time he was 10 years old, Jim had already written to Carol Burnett, convinced that his impressions qualified him for a spot on her show. The response he received, whether genuine or form letter, felt real enough to fuel his imagination. But reality had different plans. When his family lost their home, Jim experienced a kind of hardship that shapes a person differently than others. Living in a Volkswagen van, sleeping in tents by Lake Ontario, working overnight shifts as a teenage janitor, these weren't setbacks. They were education. They taught him that survival requires transformation, that comfort is temporary, and that the only reliable constant is change. When he finally stepped onto a comedy stage at 15, he brought all of this with him. His polyester suit, chosen by his optimistic mother, clashed with the rough crowd at Yuck Yucks. His safe impressions fell flat against hardened Toronto comedians who wanted sharper material. That first performance wasn't just a failure, it was a rejection of everything he thought he was. For many people, that would be enough to abandon the dream entirely. For Jim, it ignited something different. What emerged over the next few years was a comedic force unlike anything Canadian audiences had seen. He didn't just tell jokes, he inhabited them. His body became the punchline, his face a canvas of expression that communicated faster than language could. By the 1980s, he was touring alongside established acts, earning recognition in his home country. But Canada wasn't big enough. Hollywood beckoned, and Jim answered. The 1990s became his launching pad. Ace Ventura wasn't just a comedy, it was a statement that theatrical comedy could dominate mainstream entertainment. The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, and Batman Forever followed, each role more expansive, more physical, more demanding. Critics debated whether he was comedic genius or comedic excess, but audiences didn't care about the distinction. They were mesmerized. And then something shifted. With films like The Truman Show and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Jim proved that beneath the rubber-faced comedian existed a serious actor capable of profound, contemplative work. He was no longer a one-trick performer. He was an artist with range. But success at that level comes with a cost that doesn't appear in financial statements. As his professional career accelerated, Jim's personal life fragmented. His marriage to Melissa Womer, a relationship built before fame, dissolved just as his career was taking off. Some said he left to film Ace Ventura and simply didn't come back, not physically, but emotionally. He returned romantically involved with his co-star Lauren Holly from Dumb and Dumber. They married quickly, divorced within a year. Paparazzi intrusion, incompatible expectations, and the pressure of sudden fame created a pressure cooker that neither marriage could survive. Then came his connection with Renee Zellweger. This relationship seemed different, quieter, more grounded. Yet by the end of 2000, it had dissolved like the others. Each relationship followed a similar pattern, intense connection followed by irreconcilable differences. When he met Jenny McCarthy in 2005, observers noted that this relationship seemed the most authentic. They shared beliefs, a public image, a sense of united purpose. Yet even this eventually fractured after 5 years. What emerged from these patterns wasn't simple unfaithfulness or commitment issues. It was something more complex, a man seemingly unable to maintain human connection at the same level he could create fictional characters. While Jim could disappear into another person's skin on screen, he struggled to fully show up in his own life off-screen. Friends and former partners described someone capable of extraordinary warmth and then equally extraordinary withdrawal. A man who could be deeply present and then suddenly absent. But the personal struggles would be overshadowed by something darker. In 2015, his on-and-off relationship with Catriona White ended in her death. The tragedy devastated him, but it didn't remain private. Legal action followed, her family alleging that Jim bore some responsibility for her death through enabling her substance use. The case eventually was dismissed, but not before transforming grief into public conflict. Jim had experienced loss before, but he'd never experienced loss as a story that belonged to the public narrative, broken apart and analyzed, with blame assigned and countered. During this period of personal turbulence, Jim discovered painting. What started as therapeutic became genuine artistic expression. His canvases revealed something his films sometimes obscured: a political consciousness, a darker sensibility, an artist willing to make uncomfortable statements. His 2018 portraits of Mark Zuckerberg and Donald Trump drew attention, but it was his painting of Sarah Huckabee Sanders that sparked genuine controversy. The piece was crude, exaggerated, personal in a way that made some viewers uncomfortable. Here was Jim Carrey using art to express things comedy couldn't contain. This was followed by his surprising decision to distance himself from Kick-Ass 2. After the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting, Jim couldn't reconcile his participation in a film celebrating extreme violence. He said so publicly, breaking ranks with the studio. It cost him relationships within the industry, but he didn't move from that position. This was a Jim Carrey less interested in acceptance, more committed to principle, even when principle meant isolation. The vaccine controversy during his years with Jenny McCarthy positioned him against scientific consensus in a deeply public way. The backlash was intense and unforgiving. Yet these controversies, taken together, revealed something important. Jim wasn't interested in maintaining a unified public image. He was willing to be wrong, to be unpopular, to stake positions that conflicted with his marketability. But the most revealing aspect of Jim's nature emerged during the filming of Man on the Moon. This wasn't a biopic. It was an act of possession. Director Milos Forman wanted Jim to fully inhabit Andy Kaufman's essence, and Jim didn't just agree, he surrendered to it completely. He didn't step into Kaufman's shoes, he wore Kaufman's skin. On set, he remained in character constantly. Between scenes, during breaks, during conversations, never switching off, never returning to Jim Carrey the person. The crew adapted quickly, addressing him as Andy, treating him as Andy, speaking about him as Andy. The performance became reality, or reality became performance, the distinction evaporated. And it was during this state of complete transformation that Dave Chappelle visited the set. Dave Chappelle never needed to be in the room where it happened. He carved his own path in comedy, building something authentic on his terms. But he respected excellence, and Jim Carrey represented a certain kind of excellence, transformative, boundary-pushing, fearless. So when the opportunity arose to visit the set of Man on the Moon through an introduction from Norm Macdonald, it seemed like a natural moment. A comedian paying respects to another comedian at the height of his powers. Except that's not what Dave found. What Dave encountered was entirely different from what he expected. He came to meet Jim Carrey and instead found Andy Kaufman. Not partially, not performatively, completely. The voice, the mannerisms, the entire presence had been absorbed into the character so thoroughly that Jim's personality seemed to have vanished entirely. And the strangest part wasn't Jim's commitment to staying in character. It was that everyone else had normalized it. The crew spoke to Andy. They treated Jim as if he didn't exist. They'd created a reality where the character had replaced the person. Dave, standing in this environment, faced a choice. He could play along, allow himself to be absorbed into the fiction that Jim had created. Or he could acknowledge what he was seeing, that Jim Carrey still existed beneath this performance, that the real person was still there, just hidden. Dave chose to see the truth. For an entire afternoon, Dave spoke to Andy Kaufman while knowing he was really speaking to Jim Carrey. It created a peculiar tension, a constant awareness that everyone around him was engaged in a collaborative delusion, pretending that a character was real, that a man had transformed into someone else entirely. Later, Dave would reflect on this experience with humor, but that humor covered disappointment. He had come expecting to encounter Jim the artist. Instead, he found only Andy the character, and a Jim Carrey so committed to that character that he was unwilling, or perhaps unable, to step out of it. What Dave witnessed was the logical endpoint of method acting pushed to its limits. Jim hadn't just absorbed Kaufman's mannerisms or vocal patterns. He'd apparently absorbed his essence so completely that the boundary between performer and performance had become meaningless. And the question that emerged from this experience was troubling. Was this commitment to the craft, or was it something else? Was it acting, or was it a form of psychological displacement? The people who worked closely with Jim during this period described a similar disorientation. They couldn't locate where Jim ended and Andy began. There were occasional glimpses of the real person, moments of humanity breaking through, hints of Jim's actual consciousness, but these were brief and rapidly submerged beneath the character. What stayed dominant, what filled the space, was Andy. And if the real Jim was struggling with this level of immersion, nobody seemed equipped to address it. Chris Smith, who documented the Man on the Moon experience, described working with Jim as deeply disorienting. Being around him didn't bring clarity about who Jim actually was. It created the opposite effect. Smith realized how little he understood about Jim's actual personality, his actual inner life, his actual center. There was no stable Jim to locate beneath the performance. Or if there was, it was so deeply buried that accessing it required something the working environment couldn't provide. Looking back at this trajectory, Dave Chappelle recognized something that deserves articulation. Jim Carrey had spent decades developing an extraordinary ability to become someone else. This was celebrated as genius. His flexibility, his commitment, his refusal to remain static, these were praised as marks of profound artistry. But what if that same skill, applied to personal life, meant that Jim could never quite maintain a stable sense of self? What if the very quality that made him extraordinary as a performer made him extraordinarily difficult as a partner, as a friend, as a person? The relationships that ended. The marriages that collapsed. The connections that couldn't survive his intensity. The moment on the Man on the Moon set when he simply stopped being Jim and became Andy, unwilling or unable to return. These weren't separate incidents. They were manifestations of the same underlying reality. Jim's extraordinary talent for transformation had perhaps come at the cost of consistency, stability, and the kind of genuine human presence that relationships require. Dave's observations, when he finally articulated them, were devastating precisely because they came from a place of respect. This wasn't someone attacking Jim from outside. This was someone who understood the demands of performance, who recognized the cost of artistic commitment, observing that in Jim's case, the cost might have exceeded what he could articulate. Because how do you tell someone that their greatest gift might be their greatest liability? How do you communicate that being able to become anyone might mean you can't quite figure out who you are? What Dave's experience raised wasn't really about Jim's professionalism or his talent. It was about the psychological price of certain kinds of artistic achievement. We celebrate the actor who disappears into a role. We praise the commitment to authenticity, to living the character, to refusing to break character. But we don't often ask what happens to the person behind that commitment. We don't examine the possibility that the self, treated as a costume to be removed and replaced repeatedly, might start to develop cracks. Jim's personal relationships didn't fail because he was cold or uncaring. They failed because he apparently couldn't locate a stable Jim to bring into those relationships. He could bring Andy Kaufman, or Lloyd Christmas, or Ace Ventura, but a consistent version of Jim Carrey the human being seemed increasingly elusive. And for partners, that must have been devastating. To be in a relationship with someone who could be deeply present and then suddenly, inexplicably distant. To never quite know if you were connecting with the real person or with another character he was trying on. Dave understood this because he'd worked in comedy long enough to recognize the occupational hazard. Comedians often develop fragmented selves. They learn to perform, to adopt personas, to shift their presentation depending on context. But most comedians maintain at least a thread of continuity, some core sense of self that remains stable beneath the various masks. Jim seemed to have something different, a talent so complete, a commitment so total, that the masks had potentially consumed the thread. When Dave finally spoke about his experience meeting Jim on the Man on the Moon set, he wasn't attacking. He was testifying. He was saying,